So I want to talk a little bit about urban spaces and urban planning. This is really important, starting here in Rome, but it's really important because it carries through well for several centuries and throughout several of our discussions throughout Europe and into the Americas as well, and the impact of planning starting in this era especially. So the first thing I want to talk about is what's known as the Plan of Rome. This was laid out and started to be implemented in 1585 with some of the major things completed by 1590. And it's under Pope Sixtus V. He's not the architect per se or the planner per se, but really he was the one who said, look, I want this done. Here's what I want. You know, he had this vision of this planning organization for the city, and you know, he had people carry it out. So essentially, you know, Rome had been, like just about any other European city, this sort of medieval plan in which the, you know, properties were just sort of ad hoc put together. So there weren't many straight streets, and things just meandered all around, and you never really knew where you were, where you were going. You know, people who visit Europe today, old European cities still have that medieval layout. They get lost pretty easily, right? And it's hard to find. Now I guess you can use your phone to kind of give you better directions of where to go, where to turn, and that sort of thing. But back in the day when you didn't have a map on your phone, GPS, it was really easy to get lost. And that of course occurred, you know, forever. And this was important because a lot of people were visiting Rome. There were a lot of pilgrims that were more and more in this era coming to Rome to visit the holy sites, to visit St. Peter's, but on numerous holy sites that were located. Most of the churches had some kind of relic that was purported to be, you know, associated with Jesus and the, you know, old Israel, you know, whether it's a piece of the true cross or a finger bone from a saint, or, you know, the tunic, you know, what is it, the Shroud of Turin, which is supposedly the fabric that was draped over him and has his image, you know. Testing this showed it's probably, you know, a fake that was created in the medieval age, but nevertheless, people believed in this, and they were visiting in mass more and more. And they like tourists in the 20th century, 21st century, they were getting lost, you know. And you know, you turn the wrong corner and you get on the wrong street, and you know, you're in a bad neighborhood, and you know, it was bad PR for the church for their pilgrims to get mugged. When they were trying to make their pilgrimage to Rome. So Pope Sixtus V decided that he wanted to create a series of boulevards that would link the holy sites essentially throughout Rome and provide people a nice, easy pathway to get from point A to point B. And this is a plan of Rome as it appeared in this era. You can see it wasn't all that big. Here's the wall that goes around the outside. Here is over on the upper left is St. Peter's. You can just sort of make out Bernini's oval-shaped piazza and the trapezoid piazza for that. Here's Castel San Angelo and the Tiber River that kind of flows through. And so here is the Piazza de Popolo. This is one of the main gates that in the old city walls that people would arrive if they were coming from the north, and most people were coming from the north because of where Rome is located. And so the plan was to create a major piazza here at Popolo, and then these radiating straight boulevards that would go out like from spokes of on a wheel, and this would be the hub of the wheel at Piazza de Popolo, and these spokes would stretch out, and then from point to point you might be able to go, you know, crossways from one point to another. And this would be a major inspiration. We're going to see it even again here today, and then later when we talk about something like Washington, D.C., we're going to see it again. This sort of idea of boulevards and straight planning that will carry through, you know, urban planning for a long time. So here's another map. This is from 1748. And again, we can kind of see the outline of the city walls. Here's the Vatican again up in that corner. And you can really make out with the buildings shown dark and the streets shown in light. You can see the meandering elements, streets throughout the old city. But right through here and here, you can see the slashes, right, of these boulevards that just slice through that go to these major monuments. By the way, all this area that's fairly undeveloped, this is where a lot of the Roman ruins were. The Forum, here's the Colosseum right here, and this was still fairly undeveloped. Rome, even in this era, was not a major city. It had really become a backwater after the collapse of the Roman Empire, but it had these important Catholic religious sites. And if we zoom in on this same plan, you can see more detail. This is known as a figure ground, in which you have a solid for the figure and the background is left white, and so you can see the background of streets and plazas and the open churches, the open plans of churches. There were a lot of churches in Rome, there still are. But what we can see a little bit right here is one of these avenues right down the center, coming down, slicing through, and here's another one on the upper right. You can see it coming straight on through here to where it starts to get into the undeveloped area of the old Roman era. And we're going to talk about this over here. This is the Piazza Navona. This was actually on the site of an old Roman circus, you know, the chariot racetrack. We'll talk about that shortly. So here, using the same map, this is the Piazza de Popolo. So this really dark line near the top, this is the actual, you know, wall, defensive wall that's built around the city that still existed in this era. And, you know, there's the gate, there's a little hole in it. So people would come down, you know, from this road from the north, they would get to the gate, come through, and originally it was just sort of this, you know, odd-shaped piazza. And then you can see these three radiating streets that come out. Then the piazza is redone in 1662, or starting in 1662, in sort of a style like Bernini had done at the Piazza San Pietro, or St. Peter's Plaza. And essentially, here's the gate, and you can still see the old city gate right out here. And a little bit of the city walls have been left as intact. Even in modern day. And so here you'd come through the gate, and then you would enter then to this broad, you know, semicircular plaza that's elongated. And then look right here, we have another trapezoid shape that even goes back to Michelangelo, Padoglio. And then these two buildings here were built to really, you know, add some symmetry and, you know, create a gateway down these radiating boulevards. One of them is Santa Maria de Popolo, which we talked about. That's where the Chigi Chapel is by Raphael, is in Santa Maria de Popolo, and so it was refaced on the left here. That's the church. On the right, I forget what it is. I don't think it's a church, but it was just created as a mirror image so that when you're standing in the piazza, this is like literally walking through the gate here, this would be the view you have. And oh, look at this, another obelisk. The Romans, you know, all these, you know, Egyptian obelisks that had been brought back to the city by the Romans, you know, 1,500 years ago, you know, are being repurposed. And so, like we saw at Piazza San Pietro, this obelisk is now centered, you know, and placed right in the center here of the Piazza de Popolo. And Popolo, I believe it does translate as the Piazza of the People. This is meant to be like, you know, literally the People's Plaza where, you know, so many people would come into the city and gather before heading out into their pilgrimages. Here's a little up close view of the two buildings, and you can really see the way these streets are straight, you know, straight arrows, and, you know, not hard to get lost if you just go, you know, hey, how do I get to Santa Maria Maggiore? Oh, just go right straight down that street. It's at the end. Can't miss it. So a lot easier, and that makes travel a lot easier than in these old medieval streets. So I mentioned Piazza Navona. This was, like I said, on the site of an old chariot racetrack, which the Romans called a circus. And in after Rome fell and this became just a medieval city, people built their buildings and houses just around the perimeter of the old racetrack, and they kind of left the racetrack open and as an open field, and it became an important piazza even in the medieval era. But it was kind of run down and shoddy, and so the Pope decided to sponsor some reworking of it. The buildings weren't necessarily rebuilt like we would have seen at the Place de Vosges or at Covent Garden that we talked about last time, but the piazza was improved with some fountains, and this church, which we can see kind of in the center bottom of it, was also built right on the center of the piazza. Here's a nice view as it would have looked around 1644, just after completed. So we see some nice fountains and another obelisk. They really become obsessed with these obelisks that are, lying around the city, and they're going to incorporate them into public spaces with a massive fountain around that that is completed by Bernini. Does the sculptural work on these fountains here. So here's a more contemporary of it. Still a very popular place for people to hang out. They're lined with cafes to sit outside and have a nice lunch or a glass of wine or something. And people watch. Great people watching here. So here's one of the fountains designed by Bernini, and you can see the obelisk a little further, and you can see the church. The church is designed by Borromini. I'm not going to cover this too much, but it's on Agnese and Agnone. Ooh, I'm at the limit of my Italian there. This is designed by Borromini from 1653. I'm not so much interested in you knowing this church or memorizing it, but just to see that we have yet another Baroque church with a lot of curvature. And just like we saw with Quattro Fontaine or with the San Carlo, the one by Bernini, anyway, sorry, is a lot of curvature. It's flat on the face. It's not set back, and so it doesn't have its own piazza. Piazza Navona is kind of its grand space out front. But Borromini uses curvature, a concave, creates the entry a little bit concave so that it helps to draw you in. As we talked about last time, that architectural church planning is more now about drawing people in and making them feel welcome and bringing them in this sort of counter-Reformation period. And then we see the sort of counter curvature of the dome above that. And here's a view of it's called the Fountain of the Four Rivers by Bernini, which is directly outside of it. Some people say that this guy here, hang on, let me skip ahead a couple. There's some who say this guy right here is holding up his hand, shielding his eyes from Borromini's church so that he doesn't have to stare at it. Part of that rivalry between Bernini and Borromini. I think it's probably just an interpretation. I don't know that it was on purpose by Bernini, but who knows? It's possible. Here's a nice nighttime view of that. And this is representing the four great rivers, the Nile and the Rhine and what is it? Maybe the Indus and the Amazon or something like that. I forget which one's which, but the four great rivers that they knew about in this era, at least, they're representing here. Okay, so another really important one, which is more or less a brand new plaza. Piazza Navona is really just sort of making nicer an existing piazza, but that is what we call the Spanish Steps, or the Piazza de España, the Spanish Plaza. And the reason it's called the Spanish is because the Spanish embassy was right nearby, and so people refer to it. Oh yeah, that's where the Spanish thing is. So that name kind of stuck. So in this is that same map that we were looking at before. And slicing diagonally across here is one of those boulevards, right? There it comes slicing through. And, there's a church up here, sort of at the top center, that is just off, and it sits way up high on a hill, much higher than where this boulevard is. And so the idea was, okay, you're coming along this boulevard, and if you want to visit this church, you have to get to it. It's just a little off the trail here. And so they needed a pathway that led, from the main boulevard in this little piazza down here up to the church. But the problem is you've got this, notice how you've got this angled boulevard, and the church is not orthogonal to it. It's on an angle, just kind of like the same challenges that Michelangelo had, like at the Campidoglio. And so it's a really creative solution of achieving this stairway connection between this, angle of the boulevard and the different angle of the face of the church, and make it seem to work together. And here's a great view. I like this aerial view of it, of what we call the Spanish Steps, or the Escalier de España. And so there's a strong axis that we've talked about in planning, in landscapes of the Renaissance, that continues well into the Baroque, as you'll be seeing many more examples of. Oh, another obelisk, by the way, look at that up there. And you can see how the face of the church is at an angle to the face of the steps. But that axis is very strong, but they make it interesting. You don't just walk up straight line of steps. They make it interesting. The steps ebb and flow. They move in and out. The curvature that we were seeing architecturally on churches, now we're seeing in urban planning or in landscape design. We're not seeing the straight lines that we had been seeing in the Renaissance landscape planning prior to this. And so, here's a convex curve, right, at this part of the step, and you can kind of see how at the ends it's more concave. And here's a concave element, almost an amphitheater-like element right underneath where the plantings are. And then you go up and around to come back to the axis. So even though you don't go up and down straight on the axis, that axis is really clear and delineated visually. So that element is still a major part of the planning, but you can see there's a lot more curvature being added. Here's a nice view from the piazza itself, looking back up. This is a really, really popular place in Rome. There's some great gelaterias around, so it's great to just grab some gelato, sit on the steps, do some people watching, and really just enjoy your time there. And you can also see, that the church up here is really off axis, or not off axis, but off line. You can see its curve there. So it's just still a really creative way of tying these two spaces or these two elements together. And the curvatures even help to sort of alleviate or mitigate the fact that the church doesn't line up. I like this view a lot. I took this photo. I thought the lady in yellow was kind of a nice model for me, and is framing my photograph, looking up at the church and taking a picture of her friend. All right, let's talk a little bit about, all right, we're done with Rome for a while. Yay. Let's talk a little bit about how the Baroque architectural style evolved and moved out throughout much of the rest of the Europe. And we'll start with Central Europe, the Habsburg Empire. This is in green is the Habsburg Empire. This was the Austro-Hungarian Empire that collapsed basically with World War I. It was focused on Austria, modern-day Austria and Hungary, in Vienna, and was a major, major monarchy, major power player in Europe, like I say, until World War I. And by losing the war, the monarchy collapsed. But here is a view, here's a map showing, here's Austria, here's Hungary, Vienna is, right here in this little yellow dot. They, control most of what was known as Bohemia, which was, now the Czech Republic, Slovakia, well into parts of Poland and so forth. My wife is, some of her heritage is, Polish Bohemian, and she's never really quite sure exactly where she comes from a modern country standpoint, because there was so much changing of borders in that region and so forth. Okay, so what I want to talk about architecturally is an important one, the Karlskirche. Now we're starting into some German. This is maybe a little tougher one to spell, but if you think of the second part of the word here, Kirch means church in German. So anything that says Kirch, it's a church. So this is really the Church of St. Karl. Karl with a K, in this case, it's German. So we have Karlskirche or St. Karl's Church. This is in Vienna from 1716, finished in 1725 by Fischer von Erlach. And if we look at the plan is very similar to the Baroque plans that we had been seeing by Borromini and Bernini. It's not a Latin cross, it's not a Roman basilica plan we were seeing in the Renaissance era used heavily. It's essentially an oval space like we had seen with our two friends Borromini and Bernini, with a slightly extended apse beyond that. Here's the altar and little niches off to the side, and then kind of this funky narthex here on the front. And notice these two round elements here. I'll show you what these are. A little tie-in to ancient Rome, which is kind of cool. So here's the front of the church, and it has Renaissance elements, just like any Baroque church will. There's a temple front, very prominent temple front portico. We see some, entablatures, triangular, circular entablatures over windows, a fairly straightforward Renaissance type dome. But these two towers here on the side, anybody kind of recognize what these are? Do you remember from the fall semester? Anyone remember what these remind these of something in Rome?
The Muslim, I don't remember the name of them, but they did the call.
Oh, minarets? No, not actually minarets. Although I can see the tie-in. Close, Hadrian Square, not quite. Let me show you here. This is Trajan's column. This is from 107. Yeah, Trajan, Tim, not Hadrian. Close. And this was basically just a tall monument carved, meant to celebrate some of his military victories and show Romans what a great emperor he was. And so here, that's essentially been replicated and doubled on the front of a church. This is another example of, no way would an early Christian church ever have incorporated some kind of pagan-like element like this. But here it's just added in as ornament. Another example of Baroque almost excess, right, of ornamentation and decoration. They serve no purpose other than just being these two decorative elements and an interesting tie-in to ancient Rome. But also notice the curvature. This isn't quite as curvy as we were seeing before, but there is these concave curves that create essentially niches for these two Trajan-like columns to fit in there. And here's a section cut through. So on the left is the entranceway with the two columns. You can see, one of the columns kind of cut through. And then it's pretty straightforward Renaissance/Baroque interior, a tall dome with a nice lantern on top. You can tell that it's a double shell dome, just like we had seen that Brunelleschi had done. Hint, hint for the quiz later. Here is the extended apse where the altar would be, and you can see there's a second dome, a little one over top of where the altar would be, and we saw that in being used by Bernini and Borromini because it lets a little more light in directly over the altar to help illuminate the priest and the altar. So if we're standing here in the central part on the left, you can see this glow of light over the altar and this very decorative Bernini-like sculpture behind the altar with these rays of sunlight shining down on intense sculpture, and it's all illuminated by this little mini dome. This is the main dome that we see over the main space here, and it's just heavily ornamented and decorated, just like any Baroque church worth its weight. The other thing in Vienna, also by Fischer von Erlach, is a Schönbrunn Palace. This is a great royal palace for the Habsburg monarchy. This was started in the 1740s, finished in the 1770s. It's a little late as palaces and Baroque go, but it really represents the sort of secular approach to Baroque architecture, and really is meant to be its own version of Versailles, which we're going to talk about very shortly here. So Schönbrunn Palace, here we see it's this massive palace with a huge central court and these wings that come out and really sort of begin to embrace you and define this courtyard. And the main entranceway is heavily defined with a almost temple front. Doesn't have a triangular pediment over it, but it has a very strong temple front element to it. And then these wings that stretch out. It has a very Palladian kind of planning to it. We saw that in Palladian's villas. This is just on a massively larger scale than anything Palladio had done. But you know, this sort of courtyard with the wings stretching out and the little pavilions coming off the ends, that's very Palladian to that. So that's another example of how Palladio remains a consistent driving force in architecture for a long time. Here's a nice view, rendering, contemporary rendering of it with the carriages and the people dressed up in their, you know, fancy costumes and so forth. Some fountains, and you know, nice clear view of this central entry portico and the wings that stretch out to create this massive courtyard here. And like I say, this is really somewhat modeled after Versailles, which we'll talk about momentarily. We're kind of out of order just because I wanted to talk about German, Austrian architecture first. But here's one of the interiors, and this, you know, if the outside is fairly straightforward, more Renaissance than it is Baroque, this is a Baroque interior. You know, heavily gilded, heavily ornamented, lots of curves, right? The ceiling isn't just a Roman barrel vault with coffers. It's this, you know, highly decorated, curved forms. You can't even really make out, you know, the sort of vaulting of this grand space here. So that's what makes this, you know, identifiably very Baroque, is the excessive ornamentation, one might argue. Here's a nice aerial view, the drone view. Here's the front of the palace that we had seen. The planning of the gardens are still very Renaissance-inspired gardens. We have a strong central axis with, you know, symmetry. These little parterres of green shrubs and flowers are very symmetrical down there's a focal point of a major fountain on the axis, but you know, there's these little walkways that zigzag. This is actually going up a hill, to be honest, so you have like the switchbacks walkways to get you up the hill, but they're still on axis, they're still symmetrical, so that's important. This is the view. Here's that fountain in the foreground, and you see now the elevation of that hill, and there's this pavilion up at the top. We saw an example of what we call a folly in a garden, just sort of a little building that has no real purpose to it. One could argue that on a very grand scale, that building up there is just a little pavilion, little folly that is meant to be a decorative element within the garden, introducing a piece of architectural. But it's, you know, it's also fairly strong Renaissance with the Roman arches and this, you know, entablature on the center here, but heavily ornamented with this great sculpture on top. And even this fountain is very Baroque because it is so dramatic in its figures and movement and expression of emotions here. This is Poseidon. You can see his trident. He's holding his trident here, and these are all, I don't know, his water nymphs or something. All right, I want to talk a little bit about the Baroque in Spain as well, and this is really important. A couple of these buildings are going to come back to haunt you when we talk about colonial architecture, and especially some of you are going to be doing your research on Spanish colonial architecture. So you know, take good notes, pay attention here, because you're going to maybe want to refer back to this in your presentations that are coming up later. We'll start with El Escorial. This is just outside of Madrid. Started in 1563, finished in 84. Two main architects are involved, Juan Bautista de Toledo and Juan de Herrera. And we're especially concerned about Juan de Herrera, who came in later and did some of the later work to it. So this is the royal palace for the Spanish king and queen, for the Spanish monarchy, and it sits on this dramatic hill outside of Madrid, you know, just the way Schnbrunn does. It's outside of Vienna. This is a little more compact than the one at Schönborn Palaces, which was more modeled on Versailles. This started out almost more as a monastery for a very pious king, and was sort of added on to over and over to create more of a royal complex. At the very heart and center, you can see a full-blown church, and the church remained very, very important. Spain was kind of almost the central focus of the Counter-Reformation and the Inquisition. If you're familiar with that, the Spanish Inquisition, that is all part of this Counter-Reformation. They kind of went to an extreme in their effort to rid their society of Protestants and what they called heretics if you were non-Catholic. They expelled Jews and they persecuted anyone who didn't follow the Catholic faith, really to an unfortunate extreme. So at the heart of any royal palace and in that kind of religious fervor is going to be a major church that you can see in here. The rest of it is almost castle-like, but what I really want to focus on when we're talking about El Escorial is the front facade completed by Juan de Herrera, and you can see it right here a little bit, and I'm going to zoom in on that for you. Here's a floor plan. So here's the church, almost sort of at the center, and then you can see courtyards and rooms off to the side. Here's a big courtyard with a garden. Here's another courtyard with a loggia that goes around it. It's very formal planning, similar to what we saw with the Renaissance palazzos, except it has a massive church in the middle of it. Here's an exterior view. Like I said, it's in many ways not particularly even Renaissance, but when you start to get to the entrance ways, we start to see Renaissance/Baroque elements, especially with the main front entrance, which we see here, and two temple fronts. Again, highly Catholic, Catholic fervor, but yet they're putting, pagan temple fronts on the front of this building. So, like we began to see with Alberti and with Palladio, we not quite as graceful as Palladio San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice, but we have a singular temple front on top, on the narrow part, and then a wider temple front with a nice entablature along the bottom. Doing the two orders, we got the Doric on the bottom, including the triglyphs and metapiece in the entablature, and then we got the Ionic on top here. And what's key is how this Alberti-like curve that comes, and sort of joins the upper and the wider lower part. The experiments that Alberti had started, but really more reflective of Il Gesù, which we talked about at the beginning of this Baroque lecture by Giacomo Vignola, where here's his design. Actually, it was finished by Della Porta, but it's very, very similar. You got the distinct temple front on top, the wider temple base, and then just this simple curve with a couple of sculptures right down on pedestals off to the side here. And here, if we go back and look at that, a few little details have changed, but it is very, very similar to Il Gesù, to Vignola's design for the facade of Il Gesù, which was published. It didn't get built, but it was published, and so people saw it. And the Jesuit Il Gesù is a Jesuit church. That was a popular order in Spain, and so it's not a coincidence that here at the Royal Palace a Jesuit church facade was used to be placed on the front of the Royal Palace. And we're going to see this sort of form get used throughout other parts of Spain and ultimately to the Spanish colonies in the Americas. One of the most important is a church that didn't even get quite finished, but it's also by Juan de Herrera. This is the Valladolid Cathedral in Valladolid. This is from 1580, finished in 1668, although it was never really fully finished. But here we have a model of Herrera's full design of what he wanted it to look like. And there is a dome back here in the crossing. There's actually towers on all four corners, but this would be the front entrance up here. And you can see it has, you know, the two-level temple front, but the towers especially are significant because this is a form that we will see again and again, both in Spain, but also in the Spanish colonies. This is what finally got built. They never quite finished it. So it only has one tower over here. But here we see the temple front entranceway. Again, a Doric order on the bottom with the triglyphs and metopes, and then more of a actually simple Tuscan pilasters on top with these with a pediment. Here he's using more of a scroll form, kind of a modified scroll, but similar to what Alberti presented at Santa Maria Novella, another hint for your quiz. But look at the tower over here on the side. This sort of octagonal shaped tower setting on a square. Can't quite make it out, but there's a little bit of a dome on top of that. If we go back to this view, you can make out similar. It's modified a little bit from the model, but here's the octagonal drum. Here's the little dome with a lantern sitting on top. You can see that better in the model. And this is a form of tower that would be seen, like I said, over and over again. So keep this in your mind because we're going to come back to this later lectures when we're talking about Spanish colonial. Some other examples that get really extravagant would become much more obvious that they're Baroque because of their extravagant decoration. One example is the Palacio de San Telmo. This is in Sevilla from 1754 by Matias Figuero. I think I'm pronouncing that somewhat close. Some of my Spanish speakers, somebody who's better at Spanish than me will give that. But here we see the entrance I'm most interested in. This is, you know, hopefully you can recognize this as being quite Baroque. Look how ornamented it is. It's still classical, right? It's still got orders. In fact, it's a Doric order on the bottom. You can just make out it's Ionic. Then there's a Corinthian order on top. But everything is ornamented and decorated and over the top extravagant in its decoration. And that's the kind of thing, here's a different detailed. That's the sort of thing we're talking about with Baroque, and especially, you know, later Spanish Baroque. And this would also become an important precedent for some Spanish churches in the Americas. They would just, you know, when they could and they could afford to, they would just get really over the top in their decoration. It's actually known as a Churriguesque style. Sorry, and this is kind of developed from the Churriguera family that specialized in this sort of ornamentation, this stone carving work, and like I say, would really become popular in the Americas. All right, so that finishes up the Baroque in both Rome, Austria, Hungary, and in Spain. So let's stop here and then talk about the Baroque in France and in England.